Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 11th edition of the Brazilian Society for Analytic Philosophy Conference Cycle. I'm just gonna give some quick words in Portuguese and then I present today's talk in English, right? Então, pessoal, bem-vindos a essa 11ª edição, né, do Ciclo de Palestras da SBFA. Hoje a gente vai ter o prazer de ouvir a Manuela Fernández Pinto, da Universidade de Los Angeles, falando sobre intimidação epistêmica, como que o ataque à ciência afeta a produção de conhecimento, né? Em relação ao ciclo, né, o ciclo de palestras da SBFA é uma atividade mensal da Sociedade em que integrantes da comunidade analítica convidam pesquisadoras e pesquisadores influentes para falarem sobre sua pesquisa. Com transmissão ao vivo para o YouTube da SBFA, o ciclo visa reunir nossa comunidade em torno das discussões e pesquisas na área de filosofia analítica. Bom, me apresentando, meu nome é Pedro, né? Eu tive recentemente meu doutorado em filosofia da ciência, e assim como a Manuela me interesso pela dimensão social da ciência, né? A Manuela, ela tem a sua graduação em filosofia pela Universidade Nacional da Colômbia e depois o mestrado e doutorado em filosofia na Universidade de Notre Dame e 2 pós-doutorados, um na Universidade de Helsinki e um na Universidade de Los Angeles. E a Manuela, ela tem investigado, então, a dimensão social da ciência, recorrendo a contribuições da filosofia da ciência, epistemologia social e filosofia feminista, né? Em particular, ela tem feito contribuições muito significativas para o impacto do financiamento privado na ciência, desde um ponto de vista do sul global. É muito interessante, recomendo muito vocês irem atrás de mais publicações dela, vai ser um prazer ouvi-la hoje, não é? So now in English, so welcome again to the 11th edition of this conference cycle. This cycle, the cycle of conference aims to bring together the Brazilian community around some themes and research in analytic philosophy. And in it, members of the community invite leading figures in their fields to talk about their research, and all talks are broadcast online through the Society's YouTube channel, as this one, right? And today we have this honor, this big pleasure to have Manuela Fernández Pinto as the speaker. She's a professor of philosophy at the Universidad Nacional de Los Andes. Manuela got her BA in philosophy at the Universidad Nacional de Colombia. And then she went to the US, where she got her master and PhD in philosophy at the University of Notre Dame. She also did 2 postdocs, one at the University of Helsinki and another one in Colombia at the Universidad de Los Andes. And Manuela, in my point of view, Manuela's main object of research is the social dimensions of science. And in order to investigate that, she has been drawing upon contributions from philosophy of science, social epistemology, and feminist philosophy. In particular, I think that Manuela has been providing to the literature some significant contributions in the theme of industry-funded science, especially from a global south point of view, which is really cool and really interesting. So I strongly suggest you guys to check her publications, and I hope you all enjoy today's talk, right? Just another quick comment. I would like to thank Beatriz Sorrentino from the Federal University of Mato Grosso, who is in charge of organizing this whole cycle. And yeah, and thank you, of course, Manuela, for accepting this invitation, and you may start. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you, Pedro, and thank you to the Brazilian Society for Analytic Philosophy for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. So today I'm going to be talking about epistemic intimidation. This is a new concept and a new project that I've been working with Anna Lochner for the past, I'm going to say 3 years or so. So Anna Lochner, my colleague, is a philosopher at the Bergische Universität Wuppertal in Germany. We've been working on different papers around the topic of scientific dissent and when scientific dissent becomes problematic. And from working on these papers, we ended up thinking about this idea of epistemic intimidation and how it affects scientific research and the production of knowledge. So we have this project that, as I was saying, we've been funded by the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, the DFG in Germany, and we've been holding a workshop last summer in Wuppertal and attending different conferences and talks as this one, sharing our ideas and getting feedback on the main issues surrounding epistemic intimidation. So here's the outline for my talk today. I'm going to start telling a little bit about the intimidation of scientists. Then I'm going to bring the virtue epistemology framework to finally introduce the concept of epistemic intimidation as we are understanding it. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the effects of epistemic intimidation in science and why we consider this epistemic aspect of intimidation important. So to start, I think we can say that there has been an increasing hostility against scientists in diverse research fields, and this concerns particularly policy-relevant issues in fields such as environmental and health sciences, but not only those fields. Climate science, as you know, is a very well-known example of this, but also virologists came under extreme attacks during the pandemic. There was a survey conducted by Nature showing that 2/3 of scientists commenting on COVID during the pandemic reported negative experiences as a consequence. 22% received threats, physical or sexual, and 50% even received death threats. But also we have fields in the social sciences that have been attacked. So gender studies and critical race theory are known examples of this. There was a recent survey by the American Association of University Professors. This is the slide, the pie graph that I have down there in the slide, on the slide. And they received reports of harassment of different scholars, among which the vast majority works on gender, race, or political issues. So in our project, we focus on such cases, persistent cases of intimidation that come in the form of attacks, harassment, intimidation, ridiculing of scientists who are working in unfriendly research fields or lines of research. And we are interested in the epistemic harm that these cases bring about when they accumulate and thus stifle epistemic virtues, such as intellectual honesty or courage in different scientific communities. Just to give you a sense of the cases that we're thinking about, I brought this case of Tyrone Hayes. Tyrone Hayes is a biologist in Berkeley, in UC Berkeley, who became famous because of his research on atrazine, a very well-known herbicide produced by Syngenta, a very big chemical company. And initially, Tyrone Hayes was conducting research funded by Syngenta when he realized that atrazine had very devastating effects on amphibians. So he discovered that atrazine was actually an endocrine disruptor. And it had some hermaphroditic effects on frogs. And Syngenta, of course, didn't publish the results of his research, but then he conducted the same research with his university funding himself, and then Syngenta started a massive intimidation against Tyrone Hayes. This has been known also because of, as part of legal processes, the company has had to uncover all these different memos and emails where they actually talk about an intimidatory campaign against this scientist. He's a very well-known biologist nowadays, and he has been credited with different discoveries regarding the health hazards of atrazine and environmental hazards, of course. So the type of cases that we have in mind. Pedro was also very generous to share with me some of the cases that you had in Brazil during the COVID pandemic regarding the intimidation of scientists who were working on some of the initially suggested treatments of COVID, such as hydroxychloroquine, etc. So these are the cases that we are thinking about. So historians of science and other science studies scholars have very thoroughly documented, I think, the tobacco industry's misinformation campaign. So you're probably familiar with what the tobacco industry did in the 1950s and how they encourage ignorance by creating doubt in the public at large surrounding the health hazards of smoking. So these strategies of intimidation, I think, have this very important background, and they certainly initiated, at least in contemporary times, with the tobacco industry and the different plans that they made to discredit scientists working on the link between tobacco smoking and lung cancer. So all these historians and social studies scholars have shown that the tobacco strategy has been adopted by other industries, not only the tobacco case, to discredit unfriendly research fields. As philosopher Kevin Elliott points out, the tobacco strategy has always been applied when researchers discovered that economically valuable resources or activities, such as tobacco smoking, lead, pesticides, fossil fuels, pharmaceuticals, plastics, and so on, have harmful effects on human health or the environment. I think the tobacco strategy should be understood as an umbrella term. This is a term that was introduced by Oreskes and Conway in their very famous book, Merchants of Doubt. And they categorize different strategies that were actually used by the tobacco companies to discredit scientific research. And so the tobacco strategy is kind of the umbrella term that encompasses all these different strategies. And among them, in the case of the intimidation of scientists, we have this strategy that is called the Serengeti strategy. This term comes from climate scientist Michael Mann, who has suffered immensely from attacks of climate change deniers. This has been also the experience of many other climate researchers who suffered from constant attacks, bullying, harassment, etc. From, of course, the industry, but also from students, colleagues, political groups, etc. So Michael Mann suggested this term, the Serengeti strategy, as he compares the attacks to scientists with the attacks by lions in the Serengeti. And he writes, much as lions on the Serengeti seek out vulnerable zebras at the edge of the herd, special interests faced with adverse scientific evidence often target individual scientists rather than take on an entire scientific field at once. Part of the reasoning behind this approach is that it is easier to bring down individuals than an entire group of scientists, and it still serves the larger aim, to dismiss, obscure, and misinterpret well-established science and its implications. And while the attacks are directed against particular scientists, they also end up intimidating colleagues and students and created what we've called, and also Mann calls actually, an atmosphere of intimidation hostile to scientific practice. Another vicious tactic that is used or employed as part of this intimidation of scientists is the propagation of sexist and racist stereotypes. So to attack scientists, such stereotypes are often invoked, for example, that women and Black scientists are overly emotional or irrational, in particular when they refuse to tolerate offenses or silly jokes. Women scientists are typically accused of being overly sensitive and humorless, and male scientists are mocked as sissies. And we have seen also the appearance of new stereotypes, negative stereotypes, that have been created in some contexts, such as the stereotype that climate scientists are hysterical alarmists. All these stereotypes are invoked because they stand in stark contrast to the traditional idea of the scientist as a purely rational and neutral emotionalist agent. And they have been used, of course, to attack and intimidate scientists in different ways. So in the project, we aim to provide a detailed analysis of different case studies, all illustrating how the intimidation that scientists are experiencing in a variety of research fields today. We have the case of climate science. We want to analyze the case of climate scientists that is, well, nowadays sort of the paradigmatic case of intimidation of scientists in the academy and in the general public as well. We also have the cases of scholars working on gender studies and critical race theory that have received attacks in very different ways, and attacks that have been incrementing lately. We also have the cases of attacks conducted by the pesticide industry against biologists working on research on herbicides and the health hazards of herbicides. And then the case by Tyrone Hayes that I mentioned before is one of these. But also, we also have similar examples of this case regarding the Monsanto and the use of glyphosate. That's another very interesting one on toxicology. And finally, we will visit research on chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine as potential treatments for COVID during the early stages of the pandemic, as I mentioned before, showing the harassment received by virologists, such as the example that Pedro pointed out to me, Brazilian scientist Marcos Lacerda, who warned against the use of these drugs and whose research has now been validated by a growing amount of evidence. Okay, so this is sort of the state of the art right now regarding the intimidation of scientists, the different examples that we've seen of how scientists are being intimidated, attacked. And we aim to analyze or to document these different cases. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about this virtue epistemology framework, which is actually the philosophical framework that we're bringing in to think about this concept of epistemic intimidation, to kind of clarify what we have in mind with this project. So as the name indicates, virtue epistemology was inspired by virtue ethics and its understanding of the good life, using Aristotle's conception of the intellectual virtues or virtues of the mind to understand what would be a good intellectual life. So virtue, intellectual virtues, just as ethical virtues, are character traits that foster fruitful inquiry. Are character traits, and in the case of intellectual virtues, well, they foster fruitful inquiry, such as creativity, curiosity, or humility. And vices, on the other hand, would be intellectual character traits that impede fruitful inquiry, such as arrogance, servility, or timidity. So we consider that virtue epistemology is a fruitful philosophical framework for which to start our philosophical analysis of the problem of intimidation in science. Contrary to analytic epistemology, which focuses on analyzing concepts such as knowledge or truth, virtue epistemology takes intellectual agents and communities as central in epistemic evaluation and pays special attention to the epistemic virtues and vices portrayed by these agents. And here's a quote in a paper by Biddle, Kidd, and Leuschner, my colleague Anna Leuschner, where they analyze but they have a similar focus on the problem of intimidation of scientists, although they were looking in particular at the case of climate change denial. And they say, and I quote, "The core claim of virtue-based inquiry epistemology is that if an inquiry is to go well, then one thing it needs are inquirers with various appropriate epistemic virtues, dispositions, or character traits. It is therefore imperative that inquiry proceeds within social environments that provide not only the material and other conditions that are requisite for inquiry, but also conditions conducive to the exercise and, if necessary, cultivation of the relevant epistemic virtues. So notice this emphasis on the conditions that are requisite for inquiry. So in order for scientific communities to be intellectually virtuous, there has to be like an atmosphere or an environment that allows for these virtues to be held. All right. So an important contribution from virtue epistemology to the study of intimidatory practices in science is the introduction of this concept of epistemic corruption. The term corruption, of course, commonly refers to the decay or deterioration of a thing associated with losing the integrity. So we think that something is corrupt when it loses integrity. As Ian Keith explains, within the Western tradition, the moral use of the term corruption have generally referred to the loss or deterioration of the essential, typically positive qualities of a thing, and typically in ways that fundamentally compromise its integrity or constitution. So accordingly, epistemic corruption takes place when one's epistemic character comes to be damaged due to one's interaction with persons, conditions, processes, doctrines, or structures that facilitate the development and exercise of epistemic vices. And of course, epistemic institutions, that is the social institutions that are explicitly in charge of the cultivation of epistemic virtues, so think about education or science as a social institution, can be evaluated in terms of how successfully they achieve this goal, or if, on the contrary, they are cultivating epistemic vices instead of epistemic virtues. And this, again, brings us back to the point of the last slide. In order for social institutions that are in charge of the cultivation of these epistemic virtues to succeed, they have to cultivate this atmosphere when the virtues can flourish. So in this paper that I just mentioned, Ian Keith, Justin Biddle, and my colleague Anna Leuschner provide a philosophical analysis of the manufacture of doubt in climate science using the framework of virtue epistemology. They explore whether the manufacture of dissent regarding the reality of anthropogenic climate change could encourage certain epistemic vices or not. And they find that strategies of intimidation foster an epistemically corrupted culture or environment in which epistemic vices are encouraged in detriment of epistemic virtues. And in particular, they suggest that intimidatory practices in climate science have led to the vice of epistemic timidity, which they define in this way. A person with a vice of epistemic timidity characteristically fails to persist in an intellectually appropriate but threatening state or course of action because a desire to avoid risk of harm has an unwarranted presence in their motivational structure over a concern for epistemic goods such as truth. So in a way, the vice happens when this fear of harm takes precedence over the search for truth or for an epistemic good, however you want to call it. Okay, so the vice of epistemic timidity has been also documented particularly in the case of women scientists. And it can be, you can see there how it can be habituated to self-censorship. So scientists can become overly cautious and even reluctant to conduct research in certain directions or defend certain hypotheses because they are scared or they fear the consequences of doing the research or speaking out or conducting certain actions. So epistemic timidity arises as a result of intimidation, and we see this clearly in women in science and women in STEM fields. And this is I think something that has been thoroughly documented. And there's massive research on the different obstacles that women in STEM field face, and different studies trying to understand why these obstacles are there or why women make the decisions to leave academia at different stages. as you probably know. But what is interesting here for us is that this is also now appearing in the case of climate science. So we think that there's a similar pattern there of intimidation that causes women to become epistemically timid in a very similar way in which climate scientists have now become epistemically timid in different ways. I'm going to say a little bit more about this in a minute. So as a result, scientific practice is being corrupted due to intimidation. So now I think I have the landscape ready for introducing the concept of epistemic intimidation as we are understanding it. But before I do that, let me draw some further distinctions. So we, of course, want to acknowledge that intimidating people is morally problematic. We're not talking about that. We acknowledge that, and we think it's, of course, bad. And in the intimidation in science, of course, it has also social and political dimensions that are problematic. And they also have epistemic impacts in society at large. So, for example, it is undeniable that the attacks on climate scientists have led, among other things, to public misinformation regarding the reality of climate change and its human causes. So we see this in this report from the program on climate change communication at the University of Yale, showing that public opinion on this matter fluctuates with time. As we can see in this particular graph, we can see the percentage of those who understand that climate change is human-made has fluctuated between 46 and 62%, and currently 27% of Americans still believes that climate change is due to natural causes and that it is not human-made. So certainly the intimidation of scientists has had as a consequence, an epistemic consequence in society at large regarding the beliefs that society has with respect to, for example, climate change. So we acknowledge all of this, but this is not what we're interested in. We're not interested in these dimensions of the intimidation of scientists. Instead, we're mainly interested in the epistemic effects that intimidation has on the practice of science itself. So we argue that the systematic intimidation of science is epistemically problematic as it corrupts the production and dissemination of scientific knowledge. And we aim to show that intimidation has corrupting effects on knowledge production, from the agenda setting phase to the conduct of scientific research, that is the inner scientific practices, such as when scientists make different conceptual and methodological choices, and that moreover, knowledge dissemination is also affected with a negative impact on the communication and presentation of research findings. So just to clarify the dimensions that we're interested in. And it is obvious, presumably you know this already, that the concept of epistemic intimidation is similar to the concept of epistemic injustice established by Miranda Fricker in her very famous book in 2008. So similar to Fricker's idea that injustices are specifically, that there are some injustices that are specifically epistemic in that they target someone or when someone is wrong, specifically in their capacity as a knower. We think of intimidatory practices as specifically epistemic and that they target someone in their capacity as an epistemic agent. And of course, Fricker focuses on marginalization due to social prejudices, and she spells out how members of negatively stereotyped social groups become systematically deprived of their epistemic status, that is, of their ability to contribute to the development of knowledge. And our focus is on scientists who are, in most cases, not members of socially marginalized groups. So they are, at the least, people who have received a privileged education. However, when scientific results end up challenging the status quo of dominant groups, we think there are important similarities with the cases that Fricker examines. So Fricker explains how members of negatively stereotyped social groups are systematically deprived of their epistemic status, that is their ability to contribute to the development of knowledge. And we think that in our case, we have something that is somewhat similar in the sense that it is also systematic, because when the intimidation of scientists targets scientists that are producing unfriendly research, we think that this is happening because of very powerful economic or political groups that are privileged in society and that exert their power to intimidate scientists that are producing research that is inconvenient to them. So, although these cases of intimidation that we're thinking about are not based on social prejudice as such, unlike Fricker's central case in the quote before, they are also systematic in the sense that they're inextricably linked to structural relations of power in society. So what characterizes this systematic intimidation is that it is methodical, organized, and planned. And we define systematic intimidation as the result of methodical and organized efforts by groups with political or economic power who see their privilege threatened by others and who respond with orchestrated attacks to defend their status quo. So as I mentioned before, we are interested in the epistemic harms of intimidation, and accordingly, we introduce the concept of epistemic intimidation, denoting practices of systematic intimidation or frightening, such as harassing, bullying, threatening, marginalizing, ridiculing, etc., which specifically target a person in their capacity as an epistemic agent, that is, as a knower, an inquirer, a reasoner, etc. And the project has, and maybe also to clarify here, more specifically, we're interested in understanding how intimidation targets someone in their capacity as a scientist or researcher. So we define the concept of epistemic intimidation broadly. It is not defined in terms of only of scientific, of researchers, so the intimidation that happens to researchers. So it can happen to anybody. But we are specifically interested in what happens with scientists in particular. And the project has 3 steps or 3 goals, which is, oh, sorry, the slide, my circle moved. So our first aim is to analyze strategies of systematic intimidation of scientists. And I mentioned a little the Serengeti strategy and the tobacco strategy, but we really want to explain, identify and explain what are these different strategies that have been used to intimidate scientists. Then we would like also to examine the epistemic effects of such intimidation, and finally want to explore what to do about it, how to deal with these problems. And what I wanted to highlight here was not point number 1, but point number 2. So I would like to say a little bit more in the time that I have left. Oh, and this is the book outline. But what I want to do in the time that I have left is to tell you a little bit more about the epistemic effects of such intimidation, the ones that we have identified already. And this is the book. So we're working on a manuscript, and this is the book outline. So basically here I'm going to be thinking of our research towards chapter 4, the epistemic effects of intimidation. All right, so so we think that the systematic intimidation of science is epistemically problematic, as it compromises the production and dissemination of scientific knowledge. Of course, it is, as I said before, it is also problematic morally and politically, and also epistemically in other senses, but this is the one that we're interested in. And what we do is that we examine the available evidence on the impacts of intimidatory practices on scientists, and we analyze the epistemic effects that follow. So there have been different, I'm going to show you a little bit. I'm going to show you some of the studies that have been conducted. So we have some empirical evidence on what are the effects. And then we're trying to analyze this in terms of the epistemic aspects of these effects. So we've identified at least 4 different types of effects. Some that are tied to direct psychological and physical effects of intimidation. Others that are, we've called them more nuanced effects. So they're not straightforward, but they are there and you can measure them. We have what we call reinforcing mechanisms, and then something that occurs more at the macro level that we've called communal effects of intimidation. Let me go through them very quickly. So different studies have shown that the harassment of scholars have a negative impact on their personal and professional lives. And of course, I mean, this is obvious, right? So when someone is systematically intimidated, both their personal and their professional lives suffer. And some of these psychological and physical effects are tied to epistemic work, right? They are tied because we're talking about not any person, but we're talking about scientists. So they are tied to their research output. An experience of intimidation indirectly compromised the individual researcher's capacity to produce or disseminate scientific knowledge. So let me start with this testimony by Ben Santer, who is also one of the climate scientists that has been systematically intimidated for decades now. So he says, I was living in an apartment with my son, and every morning I checked under the car to make sure there was nothing there that shouldn't be there. My son didn't feel safe in our house. He slept with this wooden sword next to his bed after that. He felt threatened, and I couldn't make that go away. I couldn't tell him, son, you don't need to be afraid. And all of that led to this deep-seated anger and frustration. There's just one testimony of how this systematic intimidation affected him in his personal life, and him and his family in his personal life. But we also have studies. So according or in line with Ben Santer's testimony, several studies have shown that the harassment of scientists and academics has a series of negative effects. For example, in this 2017 study, Adversity at the University, Cassidy and his colleagues conducted a qualitative analysis of the impacts of cyberbullying at 4 Canadian universities. So they did online surveys and semi-structured interviews to understand the effects of cyberbullying on faculty, students, and university administrators. Faculty in particular reported these negative effects, in terms of negative affects such as feeling sad or embarrassed, mental health impacts such as stress, anxiety, and even suicidal thoughts, physical health impacts, difficulty sleeping, stomach aches, weight loss, altered perception of self, so impacts on self-confidence and self-esteem, impacts on their personal lives, such as avoiding certain people or places, also on personal relations, concerns about one's safety, so fear that attacks would not stop or that they will, so this was cyberbullying, they were afraid that the attacks would become physical, and impacts on professional life, so distrust of students or colleagues, not being able to work or work well, not meeting expectations, etc. So in another study, Gaussier and her colleagues conducted an online survey of 182 academics about their experiences of online harassment, including the consequences those experiences had for their personal and professional life. And this, as the study shows, academics who suffer online attacks such as cyberbullying suffer a series of negative reactions that profoundly affect not only their daily lives, but also their performance as scientists and academics. So of course, you have similar results as in the other study. You have a lot of anxiety and stress, irritability, difficulty concentrated, and feeling depressed, and related to work, loss of confidence, loss of productivity, not wanting to go to work, desire to quit their job, reputational damage, and inability to collaborate with peers. And of course, these are discriminated in terms of personal and professional life, but as you can see, they clearly have an impact on epistemic activity. So even if they classify it as personal, the fact that you are anxious and stressed, or that you have difficulty concentrated, of course, has an impact on your work, right? So if you're a scientist and you have difficulty concentrating, well, that impacts your activities, which are most of the time epistemic in character, right? So beyond this perhaps expected, not surprising epistemic effects, the evidence also suggests that the systematic intimidation of scientists leads to what we've called more nuanced or more subtle effects on academic practices. To clarify this, studies on gender bias in the academic context are relevant for this purpose. As I mentioned them slightly before, I'm going to say a little bit more now. So studies from sociology, social psychology, gender studies, but also philosophy have shown the effects that attacks on female scientists, such as questioning their competence or ridiculing them, have on their work. And these results are very similar to results of studies that have examined the effects that systematic attacks have had on the work of climate scientists. So in both cases, scientists become more cautious and less confident as a result of intimidation. Let me say a little bit more about this. So among the mounting evidence on the topic, the work by Gerhard Sonnert and Gerald Holton is a good example of this. So they conducted an empirical survey comprising 460 NSF postdoctoral fellows and 239 NRC postdoctoral associates, men and women in the sample, and they as a result of this very thorough study, they concluded that women in STEM fields tend to be less self-confident and more cautious, careful, and detailed, and perfectionist than their male colleagues. And they also submit fewer articles to journals. They do low prestige work more often, and they focus on niche topics where they feel safer. And these findings are consistent with other studies looking also at women in other research fields that I quote there. So as the evidence suggests, women scientists who have been subjects of harassment experience negative effects related to their academic performance. This leads, among other things, to women being overly cautious and perfectionist in their work as researchers. Here, we find just a very small sample of studies providing evidence that women scientists are overly cautious in comparison to their male colleagues. So I mentioned only the first one, but there's mounting evidence on this topic. I just have a sample here. And that in many of these cases, such caution is likely a result of the harassment and discrimination they receive in the workplace. So you can see some of the results of these studies showing precisely this. What is interesting for us now is that this being overly cautious as a result of intimidation, so feeling that they should not submit an article to a journal until it is perfect, right? Because they have to protect themselves from critique. Or, as I said here before, submitting to fewer conferences, right? Or going to fewer events, or focusing only on topics where they feel safe. Of course, this over caution that results from this intimidation is very problematic, right? Because it's like self-censorship. Women in STEM field, of course, this is a tendency. It's not every woman in a STEM field, but this tendency to be perfectionist and overly cautious and self-censor has epistemic consequences, right? What we find very interesting here is that we see a similarity with what has happened in the field of climate science. So in recent years, climate scientists themselves have explicitly acknowledged having been overly cautious and too optimistic in the past. To begin, there is growing evidence of a conservative bias among climate scientists and tendency to be overly cautious in presenting the research results. And this is also some of the studies that have shown this, that there's conservative, they call it a conservative bias, but it's just being overly cautious in stating the results of their research. Also, we think there is good reasons to believe that this conservative bias results, at least in part, from the systematic intimidation that climate scientists have undergone in the past decades, as some studies have suggested. So these are some of the studies that have suggested that. This study by Sharman, that I quote here in the lower part of the slide, she conducted a study in which 30 climate scientists were interviewed and asked about their response to attacks for climate change skeptics. And 18 scientists, that is 60%, reported being overly cautious as a result of these interactions. As one of the interviewees explained, and I quote, "Climate scientists are now generally afraid about saying anything off the record, maybe on the record even, just what would happen to have it misconstrued." And similarly, another scientist reporting, and I quote, "Thinking very carefully both about documenting the way we do things in terms of decisions about press releases or what have you, and also about thinking carefully about what we say publicly." So being very cautious about what they do. Exerting caution was also the most common effect reported by climate scientists in this study, above disruption, defensiveness, reluctance to publicly engage, and so forth. So being extra cautious was definitely identified as the main effect of this intimidation. So we call these type of effects, so we have this conservative bias or this being overly cautious, as a very nuanced effect of intimidation. So this is something that you don't see straightforwardly, but you see it in the aggregate when results, and you see it in time, right? Because you have to have scientists reporting results that are systematically overly cautious, and so it is a very subtle effect of intimidation that it only comes out in time. So in addition to these epistemic effects, we suggest that these effects may end up reinforcing the mechanisms that cause the intimidation in the first place, leading to what we call an epistemic feedback effect. So if attack scientists become more cautious and less self-confident, their academic performance suffers, which in turn reinforces the idea that they are bad scientists. This is something that Anna has documented in a paper. So my colleague Anna Leuschner has a 2019 paper titled "Why So Slow on the Indirect Effects of Gender Bias in Philosophy." And she documents this type of feedback effect here. So she says that as a result of gender discrimination in academia, women have a different working behavior than men. And that consequence, in turn, makes them prone to more biases and direct disadvantages that reinforce their different behavior. So in this sense, the intimidation of women in academia also contributes to reinforcing the biases and stereotypes that gave rise to the intimidation in the research place. Because they feel intimidated or harassed or etc., they have a reduced research output. So they don't send so many papers for publications, they don't go to so many events, they don't have so many students, etc. And that turns that has the consequences of them having a reduced research output, which in turn leads to different professional disadvantages, right? So they might have trouble getting tenure, or they have lower status, or they get fewer invitations to things, etc. So the effects of that intimidation in turn reinforce the idea that they are not competent enough. So you have like these reinforcing mechanisms. And we see something very similar with climate science, also with scholars working in critical race studies. But let me mention climate scientists here. So the intimidation of climate scientists can have subtle effects, such as this conservative bias that I mentioned. And this means that climate scientists tend to present the results in a less dramatic way, stressing in particular the uncertainties, which in turn makes them vulnerable to further attacks. For example, accusing them of not being sure or misinforming the public, right? See, if they don't state the results empirically in an empirically accurate way, because they are afraid and they're more careful that they should, then they can be accused of not being empirically accurate or not being good scientists. So it reinforces the mechanism that caused the intimidation in the first place. Okay, and finally, we are thinking about these communal effects. So on top of the psychological and physical symptoms that lead to these epistemic effects, we also have these more subtle effects, such as this conservative bias, and we have the reinforcing mechanisms, but we also have an impact on the atmosphere of the community. So it's not only, all these three cases are more focused on the individual scientist. This fourth type of effect is communal. We see it at the macro level. So this has been identified also by the scientists who have talked about intimidation themselves. Many scientists who have been the targets of attacks have explicitly denounced that the attacks were made to create an atmosphere of intimidation. So here I have, I think, some evidence of this. Yeah. So we can see here some of the testimonies of the scientists who have been attacked in very different research fields, and that they point out exactly to these effects. So Michael Mann, for instance, says, such highly visible attacks create an atmosphere of intimidation that discourages other scientists from conveying their research's implication to the public. He's a climate scientist. Diana Molinari, who's a researcher on gender studies, says something very similar. She says, threats are of course unpleasant, but how it affects me is not the most interesting aspect. It is how the production of knowledge is affected in an academic climate where certain researchers are regularly threatened because of their research. So we also have this effect at the communal level, where it is not only the targeted science himself or herself that has these epistemic consequences, but also the community as such, because it extends to other researchers around them. So maybe it affects their students, who are reluctant to go into specific research lines or even research fields because they are afraid of the possible intimidation that they might get. It can affect also their immediate colleagues. It can affect also the journals where they publish, which has been the case in many of these examples, etc. So it spreads to the communal level. Okay, and to wrap up, so I've told you some of the effects that we have identified, like the epistemic effects that we have identified regarding the intimidation of scientists. We think that intimidation impacts knowledge production, including both agenda setting and the conduct of scientific research. As I've been trying to show, all these tactics affect the way that scientific research is conducted, which research lines we pursue, how we conduct the research, how we explain the results in publications, and where we decide to disseminate our results are all affected by intimidatory practices. And so we think that this is a very important research to be done now in philosophy of science in particular, because we consider that understanding these epistemic effects and the epistemic consequences of the intimidation of science is certainly crucial to understand what to do about it and how to counteract these practices, but more importantly, how to, if you would say, defend scientific research against these political and economic forces that want to discredit it. Thank you very much.
Thank you a lot, Manuela. Such an enlightening talk, and so it was really a pleasure. And well, now we have some minutes to the Q&A session. We have already a question in the chat. I would just start with one that occurred to me, and it has to do with the value-free ideal. So right in the beginning, you contrast the attacks on scientists with the traditional idea of the scientist as neutral, dispassionate, and so on. So my first question would be, so do you think that if some value-laden science ideal was more widespread in society, this kind of attack would be less disseminated, or?
Yeah, it could be the case. That's an interesting thing, an interesting question. Yeah, so many of these tactics, including the tobacco strategy, I think this is my position, right? I think they work because they kind of flash onto the epistemic standards, but also the cultural ideals of what science is and what scientists should do. So in this case in particular, I think it is definitely the case that scientists have incorporated this idea of being objective, neutral, and impartial. And if you tell them that they are biased, this is very bad for your reputation, right? Accusing someone of being biased in science is it's really strong, and you get immediately discredited, independently of it being true or not. Just the accusation itself has a lot of power. And so, yeah, so maybe if we had a more value-laden ideal of scientists, this would have less strength. But we're very far away of that, I think. Especially among, like the practice of science. Among scientists, I think the value-free ideal is still very much in place.
Okay, just a little small thing related to that. So do you think that it's also a reinforcing mechanism related to the value-free ideal? I think there is also one related to it, because scientists are accused of being politically biased and so on, and they, to defend themselves, they use the value-free ideal as a shield. Like, no, I am a scientist, I'm neutral, so the ideal gets reinforced too, right?
And given that the value-free ideal is untenable, then it reinforces the problem. Yeah, this could be the case. Yeah, and that's a good point, Pedro. I'm going to think about it.
Thank you. So some questions in the chat. Beatriz, could you put on the screen the first one of the Brazilian Society? Thank you. So devil's advocate. Could someone who disagrees say that scientists being very cautious is a good thing for science? Perhaps results become even more reliable?
Yeah, so in the case, I mean, yeah, of course, and here scientists always lean in this way, right? Like they prefer being cautious than being alarmists, right? And it's a trade-off, right? Because you always have this inductive risk, so you never know when your results are going to be false, and you have to portray them in some way, and so maybe you decide that it is better to be cautious, and it's more responsible to be cautious than to be alarmist in this sense. But here, I think we wanted to point to something more subtle, and it's the fact that the tendency of being not only cautious but overly cautious has become a problem for the results in climate science, because they have systematically underestimated the problems with climate change, or at least the way they have portrayed this in the results of research, in the conclusions of IPCC reports, how they have disseminated this knowledge to the public has been they have systematically underestimated the hazards. And so this is now a problem, right? Because, of course, we act, at least in part, we want to think, we act depending on what the scientists are telling us that the problems and the dangers of climate change are. And so this underestimation has become a problem. So in this particular, I understand the point, but in this particular case, it has become a problem. And yeah, and also just to clarify, yeah, the problem is not being cautious, but being overly cautious.
Okay. Yeah, just another question from Beatriz Sorrentino. Is there any evidence that the use of Serengeti strategy might focus more or not on women scientists?
Yeah, so no, I don't know the evidence as such, but of course we have a lot of research on women scientists because it's, well, thanks to feminist scholars, this is a topic that has been, perhaps is the one that is more well researched. And so we do know how these intimidatory practices have worked in the case of women in STEM in different ways. We have much less on more recent problems, such as the attacks to climate scientists. And so, and in general, it's very difficult to say. So I think that, yeah, of course, women scientists have a tendency of being, I mean, there's a well-documented bias against women in science, or different biases, if you want to put it that way. And so, of course, they are a group that has been historically marginalized in scientific communities. But so have, for instance, Black scientists or African-American scientists, or depending on where you are. And so, and other groups, right? So those might be less well documented than the case that the cases of women in science. Now, I'm going to take advantage of these questions to add something that I think is very important in this case, is that we also have in this problem of intimidation in scientists, we also have an overlap of different reasons why the scientists might be intimidated. And so we really want to focus on cases where scientists are being intimidated because of their research and their results, right? So this, and thus the emphasis on the epistemic aspect of the intimidation. But it is well known that women have been historically intimidated and harassed, regardless of their research and their field and their lines of research and the research results, right? It's just because they are women that they are being harassed. And so when we're talking about things like research on gender studies, where scientists are being intimidated because of the results of the research, so they are saying things that go against the status quo, this is the case, but it is also the case that the intimidation is related to their identity, because most of scholars working on gender studies are women or people who are diverse in terms of gender, and so they are being harassed also due to that. So we have like some sort of intersectionality occurring here. That it's particularly, I mean, it might be also the case with now this is occurring to me with the case of Brazilian scientists working on COVID. So you have the fact that the results are problematic from the point of view of the political elite. But it is also the case that they are scientists coming from Latin America, and so it's an intersection of things that is occurring then there. It is not so much the case with Michael Mann, for instance, who is a white scientist in the U.S. working in a well-known U.S. university, and so yeah. Yeah, Tyrone Hayes, as you saw, he's an African American scientist. So you have both issues occurring at the same time as well. So yeah, it is difficult to say, but it is definitely the case that these researchers are being attacked, at least partially, not only because of their identities, because of the results of their research. So it is the results of their research, or the research lines more generally, that is very problematic from the point of view of powerful groups.
Thank you, Manuela. So if someone wants to give us another question, can wait a few more minutes. I can ask another one. I'm very curious about it. Do you already have some solutions in mind that you can share to this problem of the epistemic intimidation? And,
yeah, we also want to do like a more systematic search, because we also have so many of these studies that I mentioned regarding, for instance, the effects of intimidation. They also highlight some of the things that have been done, and the things that work or don't work regarding how to counteract this intimidation. So we want to do like a search, a more systematic search of things that have been proposed. And I mean, the most ideal thing would be to have things that have been proven to work, which is more difficult. But yeah, some of these surveys also have questions regarding what did you do when you were intimidated, and what worked best for you. And so we have some, at least anecdotal evidence of researchers telling what they thought was better in their cases. But to give you an idea of what we're thinking, we think there are strategies at different levels. So there's strategies at the individual level of what you as a victim of intimidation can do, or as a person who has been targeted in this way. What your colleagues, like what can you do at the more communal level, right? What can your colleagues in the department, your students, I mean, if you're close to someone who has been intimidated, what can you do? And then you also have the institutional level. So we think that is very important for universities nowadays, or research centers, also societies. So like the Brazilian Society for Analytic Philosophy would be an example, like academic societies, to have protocols for cases of intimidation. How would they respond as an academic community to this type of practices? And that makes a huge difference. I mean, from the testimonies of people who have been, or scientists who have been intimidated, you have examples of institutions who were very supportive and who made like the difference, and they didn't budge, they didn't they supported their scientists, and they didn't comply to the pressure of political or economic powerful groups. I mean, these are very powerful groups, so they can threaten the university to take the donations and like research funding and things like that. So it is not an easy decision for universities. So you have universities who have done that, but you have others who have not, who have, on the other hand, like completely opposite case. They have actually contributed to the harassment of these, not directly to harassment, but they have not supported their scientists, and so their scientists have being further excluded, not being able to go to campus, like their students have been taken away. I mean, things like that, which are horrible. Some universities even before they hire someone, if they get threatened by a powerful company or something like that, they might decline the offer to the scientists they wanted to hire on academic merit, because of the financial consequences that this might have. So yeah, we're thinking also at that institutional level, which is really problematic.
Thank you, Manuel. So interesting. I mean, listening to you, I would like to talk a lot more, because it's so interesting. The subjects are so relevant. We don't
but if there are no more questions, I want to ask you about this. How are you seeing this now in Brazil? Because I know the landscape has changed a little since we last talked.
So we don't have any longer attacks on scientists who are studying COVID, but attacks on scientists who study pesticides, they continue. And there is this case of Larissa Bombard. I don't know whether I told you about it. She showed how some pesticides that are forbidden in the UA are allowed in Brazil, and then we export soy to the UA with these pesticides. So European consumers are eating products with the pesticides that are forbidden there.
See, this is the case of glyphosate, so Roundup and Monsanto, no? Or not necessarily?
It's a different one. It's a lot of pesticides that she's studying. I guess there are more than 10 that are forbidden in European Union, and they are allowed here. So because of her research, some companies in Sweden and in other countries, they stopped buying food from Brazil, and she was also against the agreement between Brazil and the UA. So there was a lot of economic pressure around her research, and then she was harassed. And even during the pandemic, her notebook was stolen inside her house. She had to go to Belgium. Actually, right now he's kind of in exile, and she gave an interview recently, thanks because of her book, Chemical Colonialism. She called it that way. Where she says that she's really frightened of returning here because of the agrochemical industry, which is so strong. So there is this recent case and of harass that I can think about it.
So that reminds me of something that we've seen studying the cases, and is that exile is actually one of the consequences that many scientists suffer because of this. Maybe not in the US, but certainly in some European countries, and this case that you're mentioning, Brazil. That makes. I mean, I think we are seeing there an epistemic damage that is really problematic for countries such as ours in the global south, right? Because we're losing, on top of everything, on top of not having enough money to conduct research, on top of academic colonialism in general, on top of everything, then we're losing minds, right? Our own scientists to these intimidatory practices.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Another recent case that came to my mind is a computer scientist that, like a decade ago, said that the electronic device to vote in Brazil was not safe a decade ago. But then during last election, Bolsonaro and everything, his studies were used to say, no, the election is not safe. Lula's voters are going to manipulate the results. There is the scientist who said that. And then I saw on Twitter, when I was on Twitter before Musk destroyed it, that he said something like, I will never communicate this kind of thing again, right? This kind of result again. So that's this.
So it's like misappropriated. This is what happened.
Yeah, and then it just remember there is this term precautionary cascade. So it seems that this creates an anti-precautionary cascade, right? So everyone being overly cautious, so the reports in international languages, overly cautious as well. So yeah, we,
Yeah. Yeah, and this is, I mean, I think what is happening with the IPCC reports, for instance, on climate science results in general, it's like the pressure is so much that scientists really become self-conscious of like the, like to be very careful on the way they phrase things. And yeah, and then these reports, as you say, these reports are used to develop public policy, environmental policy, and so on. And so if there's problems with the way the information or the scientific knowledge better is portrayed from the beginning, well, it just sums up, and you can actually have people being overly cautious, right? So if the results are overly cautious, maybe the policymakers are saying, oh, but let's be cautious on these results that are already cautious, and then it increases the problem.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, Manuel, just another question. So you mentioned the difference for us in the global south. Do you think that epistemic intimidation here in the global south happens more with political groups that are powerful instead of more economic powerful groups, or both of them?
It's a good question. So most of the examples that we have are from political powerful groups. Although, so yeah, we have to think more carefully about this, because we also have, I mean, we have the economic groups are normally tied to multinational companies, and multinational companies have power throughout the globe, right? So it is not only in the global north or in the specific countries, but yeah, we're talking about the petrochemical industry, or if we're talking about chemical companies, the pesticide companies, they are global. But I think they are. I hope I'm not wrong about this, but I think they would be mostly concerned about research coming from the global north, just because that's where most research comes from. So, given the fact that most scientific research comes either from the US or Europe or now China, I would say that there would be not only the most not only is the fact that most scientific results come from these countries, but also the most reputable scientists have positions there, especially in the US and Europe. And so in terms of public impact, I think they would be most concerned with research outputs that come from these places. I'm guessing that it would be much easier to dismiss, research results coming from the global south. I think that's why this case of Michael of Lacerda is so interesting, because it also confronted this dismissal of being from Brazil, but it was reivindicated in the end, right?
Perfect. Thank you, Manuel. So we can end here. What do you think? Is it okay for you?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you
Right.
so much for the invite, Pedro. I really enjoyed it.
No, thank you, Manuel. I know you have like a busy schedule and everything. Thank you for your precious time. And yeah, I always learn a lot of you. You are really inspiring, and it's so great to have you here, and to become more known to the Brazilian community as well. It was really a pleasure. Thank you for accepting this. Yeah.
Great. Thanks for the invite. And let's keep in touch. We can continue discussing these topics.
Awesome. Thank you, Manuela. Thank you, Beatriz, for the support, and thank you all that listened to us today. See you guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.